Hello, everyone. Welcome to those of you joining us this evening and or viewing this video on YouTube at a later date. It's a real pleasure to have you here for the virtual book launch for Grief in the Margins, Grief, Loss, and Resistance for the Invisible Majority with author Michelle L. Williams. It's a real pleasure to be able to host this conversation, this really critical conversation at this moment in time. Um, I'd like to start today with a land acknowledgement. I'm calling in from Tekaronto, Toronto, land that is on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee. I always pronounce that correctly. Apologies. And the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. And it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce you to our guest of honor this evening, author Michelle L. Williams. Michelle Williams is a therapist, DEI consultant, author, and woman of color whose work is deeply rooted in lived experience. She's the co-founder and the co-CEO of TheraSource Incorporated. This digital mental wellness platform offers expert curated therapy resources to support self-guided mental health care, whether as an introduction to therapy or a supplement to ongoing treatment. As a motherless daughter and someone who carries her own stories of grief and loss, Michelle brings a rare blend of personal truth and compassion to everything she does. Through her clinical practice, Michelle supports those navigating grief and loss. Her work is grounded in the belief that grief is an inevitable human experience. Michelle's writing and advocacy explore how loss shows up differently across cultures and intersections of identities, particularly for those in the invisible majority. We'll talk more about that later. Her voice is both tender and clear-eyed, inviting people into conversations that are often avoided but deeply necessary. At her core, Michelle is committed to creating spaces where people feel supported and able to name adversity, oppression, especially when the world would rather that they stay silent. Welcome, Michelle. It's wonderful to have you here. I know Emma from the Canadian Scholars, thank you for arranging this, is going to put up a link now or just an image to share that Michelle's book, Grief in the Margins, is available right now for a special a special discount code. So please take note of that. Maybe get out your cameras and take an image of the QR code there. We will also share it again at the end of our discussion. So we're going to go into a bit of a Q&A, but really more of an informal discussion with Michelle at my dining room / kitchen table, where often so many cultures, so many rich conversations happen at the dining room table. I want to let you all know that you also can ask questions at the bottom of your screen. You should see a little box that says Q&A. You can pop your questions in there. And we will get to them probably at the end of the conversation. So please feel free to go ahead and ask for any questions. If there's anything related specifically to the book, Emma Davis from Canadian Scholars may also be typing in and responding in there. Okay, let's get started. Michelle, it's such a pleasure to speak with you today when you shared that you had a book coming out and this was the topic. I was immediately, as you know, very interested in how your book would articulate many different important themes and conversations. And I thought maybe to set the stage, you could share a little bit about, I feel like I am part of the invisible majority.
Yeah.
Why the invisible majority? And if we are the majority, why are we invisible?
Mm, thank you. Thank you for such a beautiful introduction. And thank you everyone for being here. Right. So who are the invisible majority? So first of all, I always think of this in contrast with the language of minority, right? So we hear that a lot as it pertains to conversations about racialized groups specifically. And it is a bit of a misnomer when we think about the idea of minority. Um, we are in fact, already the global majority. So, like folks who look like myself, like yourself, we do make up the global majority. But in North America specifically, we still do talk about racialized groups in the context of minorities. I mean, the language is shifting somewhat, but actually it will need to shift because, sometime around mid 2040, we will, in fact, especially in the United States, be a majority. That being said, when you combine, and the way that I thought about the invisible majority for my book, it went beyond BIPOC or racialized
Mhm.
groups. We're also thinking about underrepresented communities. We're thinking about LGBTQ plus. We're thinking about chronically ill and disabled.
Mhm.
And so when you put all of these underrepresented groups together, you then have uh, an actual majority, right? Um, and because of the systems that exist, especially in the Western world, but specifically in North America, we think about systems of discrimination, we think about systems of oppression that kind of work against supporting or accommodating folks who make up the invisible majority. Um, and so, because we're not considered, and because we're not, there are policies and practices that continuously oppress us, we become invisible. Our experiences don't get incorporated into the mainstream um, psyche or considered in the ways that policies are developed. We're not often represented in mainstream media. And our educational systems, and we're seeing this right now in the United States, actually try to erase our lived experiences and our histories. And so, as a result, I think invisible majority is a really perfect, um, um, you know, language to use to represent all of the underrepresented groups and the ways in which we are systemically oppressed. And I would also like to say that I didn't actually come up with this. I didn't coin this term, invisible majority. So, for those of you who have had an opportunity to read the book, in my intro, I do actually credit Zara Siddiqui, who is a mixed media artist from Toronto. And although I don't believe they are the ones who coined the term either. I think it's been used for a while. I became aware of that term when I was consuming some of their amazing, incredible art, and their art focused on brown and black communities, but with brown and black communities with intersections uh, of LGBTQ and disability. So, and I thought the term was really quite beautiful and perfect for the groups that they were photographing and creating beautiful artwork out of their images. And so I thought of it for my work as well when I was writing this book.
I really appreciate that. And I appreciate that reflection on how art can be so powerful and profound and influencing the frameworks and how we see ourselves in the world today. So really appreciate that. When Michelle and I first met, I met Michelle back in the days when I was the CEO of Dying with Dignity Canada. The end of life, grief, trauma, loss, celebration, all of that. And what I found really fascinating about your book and setting up that framework for the invisible majority is that I feel that your book really breaks some new ground with its expansive articulation of grief for the invisible majority. And I want to know, why was it so important for you to expand how we contextualize grief and trauma? I mean, I feel like I kind of know the answer to that. And I think that it's such an important thing because we tend to compartmentalize how we think about grief and trauma.
Yeah. So I think the first piece for that question is I don't want to conflate grief and trauma. They do go together for many, many people. But what I would say is that trauma can include grief but grief is not inherently traumatic, right? Um, and so I would say that for a lot of folks, when they do experience a significant loss, um, it can feel traumatic, um, but then and their grief experience can then be impacted by the trauma that accompanied the loss, right? Um, I think it's important to be more expansive around how we think about grief specifically, because I think there's such a cultural context around grief and where, depending on where you're located, actually, and for those of us who are social workers, will understand social location and how important that is to anyone's lived experience. But I think specifically when you think about the experience of loss for folks who come from those underrepresented, those from the invisible majority, um, if you have that loss in a Western country, then your grief experience will be impacted by the culture of that country. And in North America, we have very limited ideas about what grief can look like and why people can experience grief. As a therapist, I sit with folks all the time and I hear the stories of people who have lost loved ones. Um, but we have like very specific groups of people where we are allowed to grieve or consider to be significant loss. Um, and those are usually our, partners, our mothers, our fathers, children. Um, they have to be like almost like our immediate family for the world around us to consider that loss to be significant enough that it is worth grieving, or that we have, let's say, um, justification for being in a grief response. And then there's no space for the idea that some of the losses that we might experience might not seem significant to others, but they are significant to us. So we might lose a loved one, but they're not our immediate family. Maybe they're our aunt or our uncle who was like a parent to us, right? Um, and and then we have systems around that don't accommodate or are considerate of the fact that we've had a loss. So we have employment systems and labor laws that oftentimes will only allow for 3 days of bereavement leave. And when you think about somebody who has lost their child, I think you can immediately understand that 3 days is certainly not nearly enough time to grieve a loss like that, right? But then setting aside sort of like the systems and structures that kind of impact our grief experience, we also have a cultural context. So if you come from a culture that is not North American,
Mhm.
right, then you may have grief practices, rites, and rituals that don't conform to the ways that we think about grief in our North American culture and Canadian culture. And as I said earlier, our ideas about grief are pretty limited, right? So grief looks like sadness, it looks like weeping. It has a time limit. It can only last or should only last for 6 months to a year. Um, you can't be too expressive in your
Right.
grief.
Yeah.
Um, and or if you are, there's also a gender application to this as well, so that if you are of a particular gender, then you also have to either grieve one way or another.
Yeah.
And so there are all of these ways in which we restrict the way that we think about grief, and also the ways that we limit the kinds of losses where grief is justified. And so personally, I think it's important for us to expand our definition of grief. I think it's important for us to expand our definition of what constitutes a loss. Loss is not only death related. And I think it's also important that we consider cultural context, a person's ethno-cultural, ethno-racial background. as well when we think about or talk about grief.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I really like the distinction of grief and trauma as not being the same thing. I just think of a close family member that I lost a few years ago, and it was grief. It was no
Mhm.
trauma. They died a good death. And then, exploring the sort of the ethnocultural considerations. I remember when my father died, many decades ago, my mother was quite insistent that we were white. Uh,
Mhm.
I don't know if that was a Muslim tradition. That was a tradition that was really important for her. And it was a little confusing for people that showed up at the funeral home with the family, all dressed in white, and just really expanding both the definition, but also like what the norms are. And so as we're talking about like, grief and trauma and loss, and when we start talking about identity, I think one of the things I recently heard the term epigenetics a couple of years ago, and speaking with a young scientist who explained what it meant. I was like, I feel like the trauma in our bones comes from my mother and my mother's family and the trauma that, the women in my family have endured. She's like, there's this real thing. It's called epigenetics. There's some science to that. So I'm wondering if you can share a little bit more. I don't know if my summary is what epigenetics is,
Yes.
um, and why it matters. And then I'd love for you to share, with the audience, the viewers, a bit more about you, your personal and familial history, the intersections of identity, trauma, epigenetics. It's a really big question. There's sort of a lot in there. And I feel like it's a little bit at the heart of the book and why you wrote this book, but maybe I'm overstepping in that assumption. So yeah, what is epigenetics? Um, who are you? Where do you come from? How does that fit into? Because you do share so much of you in this book. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's huge. So I'm no scientist, so I'm just gonna caveat that right away. Disclaimer, I'm not a scientist. But I do talk a little bit about epigenetics. Um, I I kind of do make several references throughout the book where I connect sort of like a biological imperative, um, a real sort of scientific connection. Like there's actual research and science that demonstrate that grief is more than just something that we quote unquote feel, but that it's an experience that is embedded in our necessity to survive. It's how we evolved as human beings. And so, inevitably, if you consider evolution as a real thing for us as human beings, then epigenetics is going to play a part in that. And epigenetics essentially is just like it's the cellular memory that we pass on from one generation to another. And when you think about other species on the planet, other animal species, we're so fascinated and amazed by the fact that a newborn, creature can immediately know how to survive in this very chaotic and dangerous and devastating world that we live in. Um, that is because of epigenetics, actually, right? Like the parent of that creature, whatever animal we're thinking of, doesn't actually have a lot of time to raise their young. So they have to be born with this inherent understanding of the world. And that is actually genetically passed down cellularly from one generation to the next. And we as human beings aren't as much as we'd like to believe so. We're not that different, actually. So when you think about grief and loss, and we talk a lot about, and many of us are familiar with the term intergenerational trauma, um, and we can also talk about intergenerational grief, right? So if we can have intergenerational trauma, we can also have intergenerational grief. And I do absolutely consider that to be passed down epigenetically. It's not just that we hear family narratives that where we remember our ancestors. Maybe we're fortunate enough to remember our grandparents or our great grandparents. We maybe had the experience of having a relationship with them. And so their loss actually means something to us. I think that it goes even beyond that, even beyond the ancestors that we had connection, immediate contact with, that we can even remember, um, that there is this cellular understanding that generations before us actually experienced profound and devastating loss. And so that kind of brings me into my own sort of intersections of identity. So I am, my family, my ancestry comes from South America, Guyana specifically. And Guyana, if anyone is familiar with the country, knows that it's a pretty multi-ethnic mix of people. But many of those people did not originate from Guyana. So they were brought there in different ways, and some were brought there as indentured servants, and some were brought there as slaves. And so there is a history of indentured servitude and slavery in Guyana. And of course, Guyana is a colonized country, or that a country that experienced colonization. And of course, if that is part of your history, slavery, indentured servitude, colonization, inevitably you have um, multitudes of history, of ancestry who experienced devastating losses, trauma, grief, and so powerful, I would say, that there's no way that that does not get passed down to the next generation on a cellular level. You don't have to have experienced those kinds of tragic losses or devastating traumas in order to have that in some way live in your body, and even have an impact on your health and your well-being, your mental health, and so on, for the rest of your life, right? Um, and so, you know, it is like very much at the heart of why I wrote the book. There was, um, I used this project as a way to kind of externalize some of what I believe I have known in my body, in my cells, in my bones, to be true about, um, my ancestors and about the person that I am today. Like how I show up in the world now is not just what was nurtured, it's also what was innately there from previous generations before me.
So powerful, the of course we're not that different from other species on the planet, and there is something about, and I think for a lot of us that navigate very complex and difficult and challenging spaces, that there's something about the body remembers and how far, like, and where your body comes from and the memories that sort of get passed through. And sometimes I wonder a little bit about our instincts, and how they develop. Um, you know, you really challenged this concept for me as I was reading your book and thinking about epigenetics and thinking about how trauma can be imprinted, at the cellular level, and how that gets passed along. And I found myself trying to reconcile this tension with intergenerational grief and trauma in particular, and resilience. And the
Mm,
expectation, especially for certain populations, Black and Indigenous women in particular, um, that um, that there should be, you can handle it. You've got this. And on one hand, there's this sense of, yes, there is resilience. These are populations, your family, my family, who also came to the Caribbean through indentured servitude, and also mixed racial.
mhm,
Um, and yet I feel that there's something really problematic with that tension and then those expectations, and then how that is articulated in today's political landscape. Again, a really big theme, but I'm hoping that you can share your thoughts on that, because I found myself unable to look away from
mm,
that tension.
mhm. Yeah, I hear that. And I do, um, I believe it's in chapter 6. I go into a little bit of a rant about resilience and that and the way it's applied to Black and Brown folks, specifically Black women in particular. Um, and so, we've heard the tropes around Black women of being strong, of being, enduring, um, and like the only emotional expression like a Black woman might have is anger, like the angry Black woman. So there are all of these sort of tropes that sort of exist in our North American culture around certain groups of people. And the one thing that you know, as I was doing my research, and as I was reading other sort of academic papers around grief and loss, particularly in Black and Brown communities, the word resilience came up a lot. And the more that I read and the more that I saw it, I found myself getting kind of more and more angry about it because what I felt like that language was doing, it was a kind of othering of a group of people, right? So, um, if you're Black or you're brown and you're going through adversity and you're going through hardship, like you are, and you somehow make it through the other side unscathed, maybe even experiencing some degree of success, you are so resilient. And I think it's meant to sound like a compliment, like it's meant to sound maybe even empowering in some way. And I don't want to take anything away from folks who are resilient, but there's a difference between um, choosing to be resilient and being obligated to be
Absolutely.
resilient, right?
Forced to be resilient.
Forced, exactly.
Yeah.
Like where you don't have a choice. And I think that in the conversation and when we use that language as it pertains to Black people, Indigenous people, even if when we're talking about folks who are chronically ill and disabled,
Yeah.
who experience a huge amount of adversity because like we don't have systems or structures for those groups that actually are accommodating, um, that are supportive of those groups of people, then we create a kind of other category of folks who um, experience a lot of adversity and as a result are so resilient. And in that conversation, what we aren't doing is holding the systems and structures accountable for being set up in such a way that it forces all of these groups of people to have to be resilient in order to survive a system that in many cases is actually, and I'm going to use really strong language here, but is actually trying to kill them.
Mhm.
Like I I do actually think, and that might sound extreme, but I don't think it is. I think that in 2020 and during the COVID shutdowns, um, I think we actually witnessed en masse, like globally, that in fact there are systems of law enforcement and social structures that are actually killing Black and Brown folks. It's not an exaggeration to say that, right? And I think that when we were confronted with some of those events, those very tragic and eye-opening for some people events, not eye-opening for many of us, because for many of us, it was validation. I mean, in a very bittersweet way, that now everybody is seeing what we've always known to be true.
That's right.
Um, but it even in the midst of like everyone becoming aware that this was a reality for so many groups of people, that there are systems and structures that are not just oppressive, but that are actually life-threatening to certain groups of people, there was still this language of resilience that was being sort of bandied about and applied to various groups of people and individuals. And again, it shifted away from the horror of what we were seeing to look at how incredibly um, resourceful and resilient these communities are. And in that way, it like shifts the conversation and it shifts the focus away from what's causing the
Yeah.
harm in the first place, away from what's requiring resilience to begin with. And then we are having a different conversation. Now we're just like admiring how resilient people are, and we're ignoring the fact that there are these policies, systems, structures that are in fact actually inherently dangerous to many communities. And we're not having that conversation because that is a more difficult, challenging conversation to have. It requires that our systems of judicial law, our systems of incarceration, our law enforcement systems, our healthcare systems, our systems of education, that they would all need to be reviewed and revised um, considerably in some way in order to make them safe for everyone.
Yeah, it makes me think about there's sort of a bit of a, a, a performative positivity in,
Hmm.
in that I think that does definitely get um, used in almost a type of weaponization and a justification. And I think besides policing and incarceration, it 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 shows up in healthcare. We've seen research and reports and have heard the stories of Black and Indigenous women in particular and people and their experiences with healthcare and how they navigate. And I think your book does, if I recall, reference the treatment protocols may be quite different for folks that are non-racialized, non-Black folks versus, and based on this idea that somehow you're stronger and therefore don't need. Am I correct in that sort of linking those pieces together?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very true. I think that we create this expectation for certain groups of people that you have to show up in the world in this way. You have to show up and be strong, and you have to um, like there's not space for vulnerability. And I think that's an unfortunate reality that I think gets internalized and I think gets embedded into some communities as well. Uh, Again, like when you are forced to have to show up in a way that is um, just to be able to survive a system that wasn't made for you, um, then it becomes uh, internalized messaging that you receive. And I wouldn't even say just internalized. I think, I can speak to, I'm sure you can as well. And I think anyone who um, comes from an underrepresented group or racialized group can certainly attest to the messaging that you receive from your parents, um, especially from your parents, that you have to be better, you have to be stronger, you have to be beyond reproach, you can't make a mistake, you just can't, because the way that you are perceived by the world around you is already um as the like you are already the other. You are already not part of dominant culture. Um, you already sort of challenge the status quo just because you exist. And so that you don't want to make people uncomfortable. And so you've got to be all of these things. And you internalize this idea of like, okay, um, I've got to be resilient.
Yeah.
I have to
I
be
remember,
strong.
I remember when my dad had that conversation with me when I was about 11 or 12 years old, explaining that you have to be prepared, you
Hmm.
have to, do your research,
Hmm.
you have to be ready. And it really took me when I was reading your book back to some of that. One of the things that I think is really wonderful and that's a little bit unusual for sort of this academic sort of wrapping that your book is in, Grief in the Margins, is how it's peppered with these deeply reflective and personal stories, experiences, and feelings. And there's a lot of vulnerability that you share with the readers that
Yeah.
very much lives up to who you are of grounding lived experiences in the critical themes of this book. And so I want to share just for the folks, you know the reference obviously, but there was something that you wrote that I really want to share. So you're reflecting about your family. You know, you have mixed racial children, and then what that means for the implications of how they grow. You know, they're going to grow up in so-called Canada. And so you were reflecting on a story of a very young man in Hamilton, a 19-year-old youngster, Yosef Hasnawi. Hasnawi? Am I getting
Hasnawi.
Hasnawi.
Yeah.
Thank you. He was just on his way home from the mosque and from a local mosque, and he was breaking up a fight between these two people, targeting this older gentleman. And in doing so, he was shot. And when the first responders arrived, they didn't take his injuries very seriously. And they neglected to, examine and assess Yosef. And then he later died in the hospital due to an undetected
Mhm.
gunshot wound. And what you wrote, I feel like it just really struck a thing with me. And so I'm going to read part of what you wrote, and then I'd like you to share a little bit. You write, the utter disregard for this young man's life was astounding to me. And then, you wrote, when I saw the photo of him in the media reports following this tragedy, I couldn't now help but notice how much he resembled my child. There was a terrifying realization that in Canada, my child may experience oppression in the form of discrimination and racism. He may not be given the same considerations as others, and his humanity may be overlooked because of his brownness. My anxiety and fear today about how the world will interact with my child are ever present. My eldest is now a young adult, and I experience profound grief as the parent of a newly adult child, realizing that an entire stage of development and parenting has ended. My grief is further compounded by the reality that in his increasing independence, he will often have to navigate society's oppressive systems and structures alone without the shield of my protection.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
I felt I felt that in so many different ways and for so many different reasons, and I'm not a parent.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and I wanted you, if you could, to share a little bit about the complexity of all of the things realized and then how it connects so deeply with the personal, the lived experience, the existence of, your child and children in these circumstances, within the backdrop of these systemic and structural systems that oppress and invisibilize and harm us,
Yeah.
and how you are processing that.
Yeah. Um, I mean, I still think I am processing that. I do every day. And I mean, I think writing this book really um forced me to confront some of my fears for my children, who each of whom present differently, a little bit differently, um, and what the how the world would respond to them. And I think that's a very natural thing that we as parents, like for those of us who have children, understand that there is this innate fear that we have of our children going out into the world and whether or not they're going to be okay. And but then for me, there's that I think every parent has, which I think is very normal. But then there's this other layer for me around the fact that like I don't just have to worry about them just being an adult in the world and being able to figure it out. I have to be conscious, or I'm not I can't not be conscious. I'm so aware of how the world will engage with them. So it's not just about how they engage with the world and whether or not they're going to be careful and safe and thoughtful and all of those things. There's also this piece of like, how's the world going to respond to them in return? And so that particular story, that really stood out for me. That particular news story happened like many years before I even thought about writing this book. But it stayed with me in such a profound way that it was probably one of the first um, stories or ways that I connected to the work that I was about to embark on in all of the research that I was going to do on this particular subject was this young man's experience um, and how so many mothers like myself who have brown children, and I would say even more distinctly, brown children who identify as male or who are identified as male in this world, because there's a harshness and there's a ambivalence, an apathy um, about, I think, black and brown male bodies.
Yeah, and it really connects with what you were saying earlier around, there was a real callousness to Yosef's treatment, and the paramedics not taking his injuries seriously and not realizing or not wanting to realize that this young man was on the verge of dying. And so this idea that certain people are entitled to certain types of treatment and other people, are not. I think it's just so striking because I do think it's at the fear for so many parents, Black, Indigenous, racialized folks, raising their children and having them go out into the world and how the world will react with them. And I really appreciated um, that story and that the vulnerability that you shared. And Michelle, when we first chatted earlier in the year, your book was getting ready to be released. And one of the things you'd mentioned to me over lunch one day was that, you wrote the book and really began writing sort of I often look at the world as before George Floyd and after George Floyd's murder, and that you had shared this reflection that maybe it's outdated,
Mhm.
maybe I need to do another sort of new, refreshing. And, it was interesting for me because after I read your book, I was like, no, actually, this is very much a book of the times, very much present to what
Yeah.
is happening right now. And I felt that your book really gave us a sort of a solid critical analysis and framing to understand the fresh trauma now that various populations, especially Black, Indigenous, racialized newcomer populations, in the
Yeah.
face of the far right rising in Canada and
Mhm.
certainly ascending in the
Mhm.
United States.
United States.
And so I would just love to hear your thoughts on that, and some of the feedback maybe that you've heard about the nowness that I think is still unfortunately very much there, and the relevance of what your book informs us for what is happening and what we are experiencing now.
So I think that when we had that conversation, it was pre-Trump. It was like, I think it was before the election,
Just
end of
as,
last year,
yeah,
something
yeah,
like that
that's
was
right.
it.
Yes, yeah.
And so, I mean, at the time, I guess I feel like I may have been I was being critical of some aspects of the book, and that it was from some of the examples were from 2020, um, COVID pandemic, Black Lives Matter at its peak kind of thing, and that it might come across as a bit dated now. Um, and I also think I was maybe a little bit, I was maybe being a little bit optimistic in that maybe some of this stuff that I've written about doesn't apply anymore to our world now going forward, right? And I think, the parallel to that is the way that we thought about the world when Obama was elected. And we thought, hallelujah, we're in a post-racial world. And we very quickly realized that was not true. And I do write about that as well in the book. But um, but I think I allowed myself a moment to kind of like be in the possibility that maybe my book wasn't going to be so relevant anymore. And then we had the election in the United States, and that changed everything. And I did realize in that moment when Trump was elected that, oh no, like this is still relevant. And of course, everything we've seen since then and the horrifying deterioration of American politics and uh, social awareness in the United States. Um, and also what we're seeing here with the rise of white nationalism, and it's becoming a little bit more blatant. It's a lot more blatant. What am I saying? A little bit more blatant. It's a lot more blatant. It's much more out in the open. And unfortunately, I think that so much of what I've written about, maybe the events are from so many years ago, but they are so very immediately relevant to what is happening and what is going on today. And when you take a look at, for example, um, with the ICE raids that are happening in the United States, and I can't even imagine the the trauma and the grief and the loss for those families. Um, it's unfortunately it's as relevant now as it was 5 years ago, which is, I have to say, disheartening for me. But what I am hoping is that if people pick up this book, if they find themselves identified in it, that it will give them at least a place where their experience feels validated and acknowledged and true. Um, and then for those who are maybe not members of those underrepresented groups, that they will read this book and recognize that these things are happening, and try to find their place in how they can actually work towards um, fighting against or dismantling some of these systems that we all participate in, but some of us have more power to actually affect change in the dismantling of those systems than others do. Um, yeah.
Absolutely. I think that you're a true activist at heart because, in the sector that I work in, the not-for-profit, I'm in the advocacy world. The whole purpose of what we're doing is to hopefully become redundant in the
Mm.
work that we do. And so your answer is very reflective of that reality of a lot of activists, and unfortunately doesn't match the reality of the world that we're currently living in. Danielle has shared a question here, and I'm going to read it out loud because it actually was one of the things that I
Good.
commented on when you asked me to write an endorsement, because I also found it was one of my favorite insights because I found there was something so empowering. And so her question, I'll just read it all. One of my favorite insights is how grief can be a form of resistance. How can we as a society reframe grief for marginalized people so it is not just as a personal loss, but also as a political and cultural act? And how can we better validate and support grief that carries both personal and systemic significance? Big one.
Well, yes, amazing question. And I'm also just going to say Danielle is one of my dear friends, and obviously brilliant because this question is brilliant. Um, so, such a good question. I think that, you know, in our culture, and I'm speaking specifically to North American culture, um, grief is essentially seen as a kind of a weakness. It's looked upon as a deficiency. It is even pathologized in our healthcare model, right? We probably, some folks have heard of complex grief, um, prolonged grief disorder. Like these are pathologizations of something that is an involuntary, natural human experience. right? And that's because we are trying to find ways to put grief in this box where, it's something that you need to get over, move on from, and get back to um, the really important work of being productive and participating in our very capitalist society. And I think that one of the ways that we can think about grief in terms of resistance um, is to actually push against some of those narratives about grief as something that we should just move on from, and rather see it as, something that becomes a part of us, because
Mhm.
that is actually what is true. Um, it is not true that grief has a time limit. It is not true that we go through stages of grief. Um, and it's not true that we ever really get over our losses. That's just not true, right? It is a story that we like to tell ourselves. It is a story that our culture likes to have us internalize, because then it means that if we don't get over our grief, then and we cannot go back to being productive and participating in
Yeah.
capitalism, then at least we're going to become consumers of the medicines and the medical treatments, the anti-anxiety and the antidepressants that will feed and fuel the pharmaceutical companies. And so in that way, we can be of some use, right? But we can reject those narratives. We can, as an act of resistance, um, recognize our losses and absolutely participate in acts of mourning that um, kind of buck the trend of what it means to grieve and own our cultural identities through our traditional rites and rituals of grief that may be inherent in our ethnic background, whether it's indigenous culture, whether it's Afrocentric culture, whether it's Latin culture, uh, Sikh culture, Hindu culture, like Muslim culture, wherever that rite and ritual comes
Mhm.
from, that we can step into that fully and, you know, demand that our grief is recognized, demand the time and the space to grieve fully in the ways that we need to, and that looks different for everyone, and reject any kind of idea that grief is something that has to fit within a very set structure or system. Um, and I actually think that grief is political. I mean, when you think about all the reasons why people experience loss, there is inevitably a social political component to the amount of loss you experience and the kinds of losses that you experience. So I don't actually think that we can extricate our experience, our grief experience, or our losses from the political and the social. They are all intersected and entwined. And I actually think that we should speak about grief and loss in a social political context. Because I think, in fact, our grief experiences are impacted by our social and political landscapes.
Michelle, there is so much in that statement. Like, and what you've just shared there is it's so powerful. Um, we're getting a little short on time, and I'm just gonna like reframe this one last thing
Mhm.
before we wrap it up for folks. What you're sharing for me, I'm a human rights activist. That is my background. That is how I sort of look at the world in that framework, but really trying to take and being very intentional about having an intersectional lens to help us inform various circumstances based on people's intersecting identities and how that can be experienced so differently from one person to the other. And I was really thinking about what a rights-based approach to grief and trauma would mean. And I think one of the things in your book and one of the themes, and what I'm hearing here is grief as an act of resistance and of being able to express yourself in grief and reframing that narrative, I think speaks a lot to the last theme we'll briefly touch on, if we can, around collective grief and
Mm.
the power that comes with knowing that you're connecting your individual experiences with something that is larger. And can that reshape those systemic, structural, oppressive by um, creating a new narrative, a new internalization for folks to be able to be themselves, to carry something with them that, like, absolutely you're always going to have, and that's okay.
Mhm.
um,
Mhm.
and move away from that imperative to move beyond the grief, to get over it, so you can continue being part of this like never ending capitalist, machine that just extracts so much from us, even the right to feel.
Yes.
And so what does that mean about like the right to feel and experience, and carry with us?
Mhm.
And how, tell just one last piece, if you can, on the power of collective grief.
Yeah, it is really powerful. And yeah, that is such a big that could be a whole workshop. I have actually done entire workshops on collective grief. Um, so that is its own subject in its own right. And so just to kind of like give people at least a sense of what does that mean, right? What is collective grief? We've all experienced it. And I think the one unifying most recent experience of collective grief was COVID. And I think for a lot of folks, I remember speaking about this like years ago when I did a segment on the social. And I actually remember people responding to that segment where I was interviewed, and they were like, "Oh, I'm not grieving. I don't have collective grief. I don't know what she's talking about." And I thought, that's really interesting because again, here it is, this narrative that loss is only we only grieve losses related to death. And it's just not true. So many of us were grieving the loss of social connection. We were grieving the loss of the life that we had before. We were grieving the loss of our anticipated experiences. We were grieving the loss of future endeavors that were put on hold. Like, there are so many ways that we were all grieving, right? And then there were other folks who were experiencing loss of housing, loss of food security. There were folks who were actually experiencing COVID and experiencing long COVID, loss of their health, right? The security of knowing that they were healthy. Um, and and so that is probably one example of collective grief that we can all connect to, regardless of who we are or where we are in our lives. And then another example of a collective grief that I always use to just give people an image of like, what does that look like for a community is Black Lives Matter. Because although Black Lives Matter is a social political movement that advocates for the rights of Black people, um, it's also an act of public mourning, right? So we can always look at Black Lives Matter as an example of what does it look like for an entire community of people to grieve together, because Black Lives Matter at its peak in 2020 was absolutely in response to a multitude of shootings of Black people by law enforcement, culminating with George Floyd. And in my opinion, that was such a like incredible and devastating and beautiful example of what collective grief can actually look like.
Ooh, Michelle, thank you so much. If you haven't read this book, I really recommend that you do. I I'm sorry to say, Michelle, that there will be many more acts of collective
Ah,
grief in the current maelstrom of the
yeah.
political, social, cultural world that we are now living in. And I think for me, that is why your book and the framework that it presents, and how we can be empowered through grief, and share that in the collective, is is going to be as important when you first wrote this book, and unfortunately in the years to come. So I just really want to thank you for what you've created here, and I think that for folks that do read the book, they're going to be there's a lot in there, can be read on many different levels, and the personal stories alone are just so powerful. And so I want to thank you for sharing so much of yourself, your family, your heritage in your book and in this conversation, um, and for giving us the language, to understand what has actually been transpired over, many, like hundreds of years of economic, oppressive damaging, harmful, destructive systems, and then how that intersects with grief, trauma, intergenerational trauma, and intersecting identities. It's a book for the ages. So thank you so much. I want to
Thank
thank
you,
the
Shanaaz.
Canadian scholars for hosting us this evening. And I want to put up the book cover that you should all, if you're watching this, whether on YouTube or live, consider scanning the QR code to receive that discount to purchase Grief in the Margins. I think it's a super important book. So Michelle, thank you for tonight, for sharing so much. I look forward to seeing what your possible next future project might be. So
Thank
thank
you
you.
so much, Shanaaz. And thank you so much, everyone, for coming tonight. I really appreciate it.
Okay, wonderful. Good night, all.
Take care. Bye-bye.